A young man from Texas sits down at a campfire with some of his buddies here in Virginia, and he decides to pen a letter home. In that letter, he details events that unfold at 3 different battles in Virginia. And this is all in one of the first years of the American Civil War. He talks to his wife, and he tells his wife how he wants his children to go to school if it's not too much of an inconvenience. He wants his wife to make sure that they know the fear of God, to make sure that they are raised up right, that they mind their mother, and that they be good little children. He tells her of events such as laying down on his face while shells burst above his head. He speaks of his fear of not being able to come back home. He wants his family to pray for him and to pray to God that one day he'll see peace again. He said he's seen enough of the war. And then he tells her that he will come back home to his children as soon as he can. Well, he's sitting outside of Antietam just before he ends up writing this letter. And unfortunately for this man, that's a promise that he made to his children that he'll never be able to keep. Because soon, he'll be in Miller's cornfield. We're out of Gainesville Mill to talk about the events that unfolded out here for 1st Texas and Hood's Brigade. This fight would end up giving Lee his first real taste of victory out here. The Army of Virginia, Northern Virginia, as it would be called, would end up having an overwhelming victory out here, thanks to the largest frontal assault of the American Civil War. Now, a lot of people seem shocked when I say that. A lot of people I talk to who are fans of the Civil War, not necessarily historians, but have read a lot of books and done a lot of studies, they think about the Civil War and they think that the first thing that comes to their mind of the largest frontal assault, maybe that's in Tennessee, or maybe that's the infamous Pickett's Charge. Pickett's Charge ain't got nothing on this. The frontal assault that happens out here is so overwhelming. The amount of men that the Confederates throw into the fight, there's no wonder why they took this position out here. They took it because that frontal assault was huge. Thousands and thousands of men poured across the fields, just directly to my left, right in my direction here, where Fitz Porter would have his cannon set up here at the top of this hill, and 3 lines of infantrymen would be waiting on them through this area where there would be a swampy underbrush, a thicket of woods, and cavalry just on the other side. But somehow, Texas broke through. And that's where Texas got their reputation. And they were endeared in the heart of their commanding officer, their general, Robert E. Lee. Now, John Porter has been up here at the top of this hill with his men stationed all throughout the woods in front of me. He's got line after line set up and ready to go. He's got his cannons up here. He's got a cavalry looking out for the flank. He's got a pretty good position. But Robert E. Lee didn't attack this position because he thought he was going to lose. He saw a portion of the Union Army separated, and he thought he could come over here, attack it, not only defeat it, but maybe back it up against a body of water to where he could trap it and cause it to surrender. That was the hopes of Robert E. Lee. Now here on this battlefield for the Confederate Army, you've got Lee, you've got Stonewall Jackson, you've got Longstreet, you've got John Bell Hood, even old George Pickett's out here in these fields. He ends up getting injured. Texas doesn't have the reputation that they had at the late part of the war. They're just like everybody else, kind of new. And really, Jackson's the one that's coming in here with a real reputation. John Bell Hood is really yet to be heard from. After an entire day, really, of the Confederate Army assaulting the Union Army here on these hills, Lee is kind of pressed. He doesn't know what to do to break the lines, and certainly upset. And he comes across John Bell Hood, and he hollers out to John Bell Hood, "Can you take these lines?" To which John Bell Hood replies, "I will try." And that's it. That's the assault. I will try. Well, John Bell Hood has a brigade that's certainly willing to try. And they're good soldiers. And they are battle tested and ready. Although this is their first real battle. And they try. And they do. They succeed. They come up here. They break these lines. And they put the Union Army on the run. Now you can't tell by looking at it today, but this area in front of us here, this is part of where the grand assault happened. This is where Texas rushes down that hill that's directly in front of us, through a swamp and up this hill right here. Now, back then, a lot of the trees would have been chopped down or cleared, but there was still a lot of brush and tree and debris in the way. The cannonballs flying through these woods, cut down a lot of trees. And as the Confederates come pouring down that hill, one man, John Stewart with the 44th New York, would say, "All was disorder and excitement. The field was full of men running for their very lives, and it was almost impossible to make any resistance to the tide of humanity pressing down upon us." Now that's his recollection of what happened here. Standing up on this hill, however, you might get the feeling that you're in a pretty good position to fight. Now the brigade's on the move out here. Hood breaks through one line, then the second line, eventually pushing through the third line. And all along the way, they're leaving bodies behind. One soldier after another. There's a story out here that I told not too long ago about a dog that was laying with a Texas soldier's body, one that was left behind. He stayed with that body until it was buried. And the fight wasn't over with. Once they got through those lines and they were able to split it open and start that chaotic movement of soldiers rushing back up this hill towards their inner lines, it looked like they were going to roll the entire Union Army up, at least this portion of it. But when they got to the top, they met one fierce resistance up here, with cannons firing in their faces. And then comes the cavalry. Sabers were ablaze, shining, glistening even, as one man described it. The clanging of metal, the heavy beating of the hooves, and the horses go across these fields. And all the while, Gage and the rest of Texas is standing up here in this clearing just ahead of me, getting ready to be cut down by the cavalrymen that are out here. But it wouldn't happen. Texas fights off the cavalry. The rest of Lee's men make it up to the hill here, and they continue to press. Eventually, this position becomes something that the Union Army can't keep. But as much of a victory as it was for John Bell Hood, Robert E. Lee, and the Confederate Army, it was a victory for the Union Army as well. Because Fitzjohn Porter was here, kind of as a rear guard almost. He did his job. He slowed down that lethal army. He kept the main body safe, and eventually they got across the river to the other side. And they would go on fighting again and again. And First Texas, Grenville Gage would be a part of that fight. Here we are in that clearing. Right here. The sounds all around us. The cannons firing. Cavalry. The Confederate Army yelling like furies, as they used to say. Screaming at the top of their lungs. Coming up the hill. The Union soldiers with their manly yells fighting back. And death and destruction happening all around. For all of the valor that is told, someone's story ends here on this hill at Gaines Mill, just in front of the Watts house. It's sad for some, victorious for others. At the end of the day, these soldiers would sit out here at campfires and they would write letters back home. They would ask for things to eat, ask their families to pray for them. Simple gestures, things that you and I would probably do too, writing back home. A lot of them would ask the question, "Where's my letter? Why haven't you written to me? I've written you many times and I have not heard from you once." That's especially true for the Confederacy, because if you live in Texas and there is a blockade on the Mississippi River, which there was at the time, the likelihood of your letters getting to you from Texas is slim to none. That was the case for Gage. But as these soldiers sat around campfires here at Gaines Mill, those soldiers that we talked about, where their stories ended here, well, some of them would actually write in their letters back home, and they would tell their family members about how glorious the battle may have been, or perhaps how some young heroic man from their neighborhood had passed on and maybe had passed a few words to go back home to tell mother I miss her, or to tell my dad I died for my cause, or to tell my family that I died facing the enemy. Things to that effect. Even in death, they wanted to seem bigger than life. They wanted to seem like their death wasn't just a waste, that they weren't just another number. They wanted to count. And that's really what we're talking about when we tell these personal stories out here, these individual soldier stories. People that really wanted to count. Well, we came back over here to Eltham's Landing, really to what I consider to be the starting point of this story, to talk about Texas and the price they paid. For the courage and the reputation that they had, there was a price to pay. We mentioned that in this story, that in that letter, only 3 men survived from the list of men that he listed. James Enlaw was wounded at Gaines Mill and discharged after Antietam. Benjamin Buckner died in a Richmond hospital in April of 1863, likely of disease. A.B. Harris was killed at Chickamauga during the famous charge at the Brotherton House. Solomon Laster, the one that was the good boy, was wounded in that same battle, and then he deserted in the spring of 1864. At the Wilderness, J.H. Arnold was killed during the famous Texas charge. Again, another charge with Texas involved, where they were telling Lee to go to the rear. Now, the 3 men that survived from this letter, that were mentioned in this letter, James McCarter was a first sergeant, and he survived the war. James Rogers was captured during the Richmond evacuation, and he was paroled May 2nd in Ashland, Virginia. He survived the war. James Freeman was wounded in Malvern Hill and at the Wilderness as well, and then surrendered at Appomattox. And he manages to survive the war as well. It's a pretty amazing story. And all of these men were this guy's friend, or Gage's friend, and they were mentioned in it. Shortly after this letter, Gage and his unit, they make their way north, and they end up fighting against Pope's army in a railroad cut. And they fight at the Battle of Second Manassas. They fight at Thoroughfare Gap, and they make their way to Sharpsburg, Maryland, where ultimately they would find their way fighting in the Battle of Antietam. Like the rest of the Texans heading into Antietam, Gage was held in reserves. And that morning that he was held in reserves, the men had fired up food for the first time in quite some time. And they were about to have breakfast. But then that's when Jackson got hit hard by Hancock. The men were mad as hell because they were being called up to fight, without even having to put a morsel in their mouth. Many men talked about that after the battle was over with and wrote about it too. So they went into this fight, and they went into it with anger deep inside them. And they fought harder than they probably have fought in a long time, which would explain the amount of casualties there at Antietam. The reserves being angry as hell because they didn't have breakfast. They just sat down not too far from the Dunkard Church, and they were cooking up food. They were called into the fight, and 5th Texas went to the East Woods. The 4th Texas was the flank guards, but the 1st Texas, with Grenville Gage, would end up going right up the middle, right into the cornfield, straight into the fight. Now, there's no way of knowing exactly what point the man died. There's no way of knowing what his last words were, his last thoughts, or anything like that. You can only take your own human experience and apply it to a person going through a battle and fighting and dying on a battlefield far, far away from home. Remember, he's from Texas. Maryland is a lot further away than he probably ever thought he'd ever be. But as he pressed through the cornfield fighting at some point in time that day, he ends up being hit. And he goes down. And he dies there in that cornfield, alone, and yet surrounded by thousands. He may have very well been one of the casualties out there on those fields when those photographs were taken. Nobody will ever really know. But for Grenville Gage, he had made one last promise in his letter home. He said, "Tell my kids that I will be home as soon as I can." Paraphrasing, of course. But he was never able to keep that promise. That was the end for Grenville Gage. That day for 1st Texas was a bad day in Antietam. Texas lost 9 color bearers there in the Cornfield. They lost 2 flags. And they had a casualty rate of somewhere near 83%, just for that one battle. That's a huge amount of men from one unit to go down in a field. Gage was one of those men, and he would never make it back home. It was the end of the war for him, and his family likely wouldn't find out that he passed away until many months later, still thinking that their father was alive, that their husband was coming home, that their brother and son would see them someday. That's the cost that these men paid for this Civil War. Men on both sides, North and South. That was a hell of a price to pay. In his last letter home, Grenville Gage writes to his wife these poignant words. Dear wife, I want you to raise our little children up in the fear of the Lord. Teach them the way in which they should go, and I hope they will not depart from it. Tell Varilla, John, James, Wilson, Ashburn, and little Ann that their papa wants them to be good little children, and to mind their mother, and be good little children. And then I will be home to see them as soon as I can. I remain as ever, your loving husband until death. Grenville L. Gage. Well, this story's over, and we're moving on from here on to the next one. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, and hope you come back to check out some more. Be on the lookout for the next series, as we're heading to the next battlefield here pretty soon. And we're going to tell another personal story about a soldier. It has quite the story to tell. Can't wait to get it started. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.
you.